repeating the single most catastrophic strategic mistake in American military history, the mistake that killed 281 American soldiers, cost $843 billion in today's money, destroyed a presidency, shattered the credibility of American military institutions for a generation, and ended in the most humiliating withdrawal of a superpower from a conflict since Napoleon retreated from Moscow, and doing it not out of ignorance of the original mistake, but with the full historical record of that mistake available, fully documented, exhaustively studied in every war college on Earth, and specifically cited in the classified strategic assessments that American intelligence agencies have been filing about Taiwan contingency planning for the past 8 years. Sounds like the kind of national self-delusion that only happens in the chapters of history that later generations find incomprehensible. Yet the pattern that destroyed America's position in Vietnam is not merely echoing in Taiwan today. It is replicating with a specific, systematic, and accelerating fidelity of an institution that has studied its own failure so carefully and so comprehensively that it has developed the precise capacity to recognize the failure in theory and reproduce it in practice. The mistake America is making in Taiwan right now is not the same mistake it made in Vietnam in every detail. Wars are never identical. But the foundational error, the specific, devastating, politically driven gap between what American strategic planning officially claims about an ally's military capability and what that ally's military capability actually is not merely similar to the Vietnam era. It is the Vietnam era wearing different geography, different technology, and a different adversary's face, while containing inside it the same hollow core of institutional optimism over operational reality that collapsed America's entire Vietnam position in the spring of 1975 when the North Vietnamese Army moved south. And the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, which American planning had assessed as capable of defending itself, discovered in 73 days what the assessment had never honestly confronted, that it was not. To understand why the parallel between America's Vietnam mistake and America's current Taiwan posture is not a rhetorical flourish designed to generate alarming headlines, but a substantive strategic analysis with specific, documented, operationally verifiable dimensions that American defense officials are debating in classified forms with the specific urgency of people who can see a pattern they recognize and cannot stop. We need to understand the precise mechanism of the Vietnam failure, why that mechanism exists independently of the specific geography and technology and adversary of any particular conflict, and why it is visible in the current American approach to Taiwan's military capability with a clarity that the historical record makes impossible to misread once you have read the record carefully. The Vietnam failure was not, despite the simplified narrative that has attached itself to the conflict in popular memory, primarily a failure of military tactics, of political will, or of the American military's capacity to fight effectively in counterinsurgency environments. Those failures existed, but they were symptoms of a deeper institutional disease whose mechanism was specific and reproducible. The systematic production, distribution, and political protection of optimistic assessments of South Vietnamese military capability that were disconnected from the operational reality on the ground, produced by an institutional assessment process that had strong incentives to generate assessments confirming the investment's adequacy, and essentially no effective mechanism for producing honest assessments that challenged it. The Military Assistance Command Vietnam, MACV, spent 14 years and $161 billion in today's money training, equipping, and advising the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. For 14 years, MACV's official assessments of ARVN combat effectiveness described steady improvement, increasing capability, and growing readiness to assume primary responsibility for South Vietnam's defense. For 14 years, the classified reporting from American advisors in the field told a substantially different story. A story of units that looked capable on paper and collapsed under pressure in the field, of commanders selected for political loyalty rather than military competence, of training programs that produced soldiers who knew the procedures and lacked the will, of an institution whose organizational culture was built around performing adequacy for American observers, rather than building the actual military effectiveness that the performance was supposed to demonstrate. The gap between the official assessment and the advisor reports was not hidden. It was not unknown to senior American officials. It was managed, suppressed in the official reporting chain, discounted in the analytical products that reached decision makers, and overwhelmed by the institutional momentum of a $161 billion investment that could not afford, politically or institutionally, to be honestly assessed as failing to achieve its purpose. The specific dimensions of the Vietnam assessment failure that are now visibly replicating in the American approach to Taiwan's military capability must be examined with the specificity that the situation demands, because the parallel is not impressionistic or atmospheric. It is structural, institutional, and operating through the same organizational mechanisms that produced the original failure. The United States has been providing military assistance to Taiwan since 1979 under the Taiwan Relations Act, which obligated the United States to provide Taiwan with defensive arms sufficient to maintain its self-defense capability. Since 2001, that military assistance has been structured around a series of foreign military sales agreements that have transferred to Taiwan approximately $19.4 billion in military equipment. Patriot missile defense systems, F-16 fighter aircraft, M1A2T Abrams main battle tanks, Harpoon coastal defense cruise missiles, and most recently the HIMARS rocket artillery system, whose operational effectiveness Ukraine has demonstrated in its war with Russia. The official American assessment of this investment, as represented in the annual reports to Congress from the Department of Defense on Taiwan's military forces and in the classified national intelligence estimates that govern American contingency planning for a Taiwan Strait crisis, describes a Taiwan military that is steadily improving its warfighting capability, integrating American systems with indigenous capabilities, and developing the asymmetric defense posture that is most credible against China's specific A2AD and amphibious assault capabilities. That is the official assessment. Now we need to examine what the classified field reporting from American military advisors, training teams, and liaison officers who have actually worked with Taiwan's military says about the same capability. And what it says, according to sources familiar with those classified products who spoke to the American defense publications, Breaking Defense and Defense One in the past 18 months, is something considerably less encouraging than the official assessment, something that sounds, to anyone who has read the declassified MACV advisor reports from Vietnam with careful attention, uncomfortably familiar. The specific capability gaps that American military personnel working with Taiwan's armed forces have been documenting in their classified reports for the past 6 years cluster around 4 areas whose combination is not merely concerning, but operationally decisive in the specific contingency they are intended to address. The first and most fundamental is the training realism gap. Taiwan's conscript military, which underwent a significant reform in 2013 that shortened mandatory service from 1 year to 4 months and has only recently been reversed back to 1 year, following the strategic shock of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, has spent the past decade training against a threat scenario and at a tempo and intensity level that American advisors consistently describe as insufficient to build the individual and small unit combat capability that China's combined arms assault would require Taiwan's defenders to possess. The specific training deficit is not abstract. It shows up in concrete, measurable ways that American training teams have documented repeatedly. Taiwan Army infantry units that can execute their standard operating procedures correctly in a training environment, but show marked degradation in simulated combat stress conditions. Reserve forces whose annual training collop is 4 to 7 days, and whose commanders candidly acknowledge to American counterparts that their units cannot perform their assigned wartime missions without significantly longer mobilization and training periods that the current reserve system does not provide. And an officer corps whose promotion culture has historically rewarded political reliability and administrative competence over tactical proficiency and combat leadership in ways that American observers describe, in the specific candid language of classified advisor reporting, in terms whose parallel to the MACV advisor reports on ARVN officer promotion is not subtle. The second capability gap is the will to fight problem, the most important and least quantifiable dimension of any military's actual combat capability, and the dimension that the MACV assessment process most catastrophically failed to honestly evaluate in the 14 years it was assessing ARVN. American military professionals who have worked with Taiwan's armed forces consistently describe a military whose institutional culture reflects the specific psychological ambiguity of a society that is simultaneously committed to its democratic identity and genuinely uncertain about whether dying in its defense is a price its population will willingly pay against the specific adversary that threatens it. This is not a moral criticism. It is an honest assessment of a society's relationship with its own military service. Taiwan's military has not fought a war since 1958. Its population has lived for 67 years in a security environment managed by the implicit American security guarantee that has made the cost of serious military preparation feel unnecessary and the cost of actual combat feel hypothetical. The specific psychological readiness that combat requires, the willingness of soldiers and small unit leaders to continue fighting under the specific, overwhelming, terrifying conditions that China's combined arms assault on Taiwan's beaches and urban terrain would produce, is a capability that cannot be assessed from organizational tables and equipment inventories. It is built through years of hard, realistic training under conditions that approximate actual combat stress. And the training realism gap that American advisors have documented in Taiwan's military is precisely the gap that prevents that psychological readiness from being built. Now we need to examine precisely how the institutional assessment mechanism that produced the Vietnam failure is replicating in the current American approach to Taiwan, because the mechanism is the most important dimension of the parallel, more important than the specific capability gaps, more important than the training deficits, more important than any individual element of Taiwan's military posture, because it is the mechanism that prevents those specific problems from being honestly acknowledged and effectively addressed. In Vietnam, the mechanism operated as follows. American advisors and training teams filed honest reports about ARVN capability in their classified field reporting. Those reports were received by MACV's J2 intelligence staff, were summarized in the analytical products that moved up the reporting chain, and were systematically optimized, not falsified, but selectively presented, contextualized, and weighted to produce aggregate assessments that confirmed the progress narrative that the investment required politically and institutionally. Negative field reporting was framed as identifying areas for continued improvement in a force making steady overall progress. Specific unit failures were attributed to specific correctable factors, rather than to systemic problems with the military's fundamental capability. The occasional honest dissent that made it into official products, the assessments by John Paul Vann, the reports of the Army's own Systems Analysis Office, was absorbed by the institutional momentum of a $161 billion commitment and did not materially change the official picture. The result was that American decision-makers in Washington were receiving a systematically optimistic picture of ARVN capability that bore a consistent and widening gap from the operational reality that American advisors in the field were documenting. That gap was the Vietnam failure, not the specific battles, not the specific tactical failures, the gap between the assessment and the reality sustained over 14 years that prevented the American strategic approach from accurately confronting what its investment was and was not achieving. The mechanism that is replicating in the current American approach to Taiwan is not identical in its operational details. The institutional pressures that produce optimistic assessments are different. The reporting chain is different. The political context is different. But the fundamental dynamic is operating through the same institutional logic. An American security assistance program of enormous scale, whose political and strategic justification depends on the assessed adequacy of its results, generating assessments that are shaped, not falsified, but shaped, by the institutional investment in the program's success in ways that produce a consistent and growing gap between what the assessments say and what the classified field reporting documents. Leaked portions of the Classified Defense Security Cooperation Agency's Taiwan assessment reports, described to the Wall Street Journal in 2023, painted a picture of Taiwan's military readiness that was described by current and former officials as significantly more pessimistic than the public posture of American Taiwan policy acknowledged. American officials who spoke on background and described specific instances in which assessment products were revised at senior levels to remove language whose specific characterization of Taiwan capability gaps was assessed as unhelpfully precise in its negativity. This is the Vietnam mechanism, not fabrication, calibration. The calibration of official assessment to the political requirements of the investment rather than to the operational reality the assessment is supposed to accurately describe. The historical parallel extends beyond the assessment mechanism to the specific strategic logic that the assessment mechanism was designed to protect, the logic of deterrence through demonstrated Allied capability. In Vietnam, the American investment in ARVN was justified by the strategic logic of Vietnamization, the concept that a sufficiently equipped, trained, and supported South Vietnamese military could take primary responsibility for its own defense and make American withdrawal strategically sustainable. Vietnamization was not a lie. It was a strategic aspiration that the institutional assessment mechanism was supposed to honestly evaluate and report on. The lie, if lie is even the right word for what was more precisely an institutional failure of honest evaluation, was in the assessment of Vietnamization's progress. Taiwan's self-defense strategy, as described in American strategic guidance, operates on a logic whose structure is essentially identical to Vietnamization. A sufficiently equipped, trained, and supported Taiwan military can impose costs on a Chinese amphibious assault sufficient to deter the assault from being launched, to defend successfully if deterrence fails, and to hold the situation long enough for American forces to intervene decisively if Taiwan's own defense proves insufficient. This strategic concept, like Vietnamization, is not inherently wrong. It is the correct approach to the specific strategic problem that Taiwan's geography and China's capability present. But its validity as a strategic concept depends entirely on the accuracy of the assessment of Taiwan's military capability that underpins it. And the assessment of Taiwan's military capability, for the same institutional reasons that the assessment of ARVN capability was systematically optimistic in Vietnam, is being produced in an institutional environment that makes honest, operationally grounded, negative assessment politically and institutionally costly in ways that skew the assessments being produced. But here is where the Vietnam-Taiwan parallel becomes not merely historically instructive, but operationally urgent. And here is where the gap between America's official assessment of Taiwan's military capability and the actual capability that assessment is supposed to describe has the most direct and most dangerous consequences for the specific strategic question that American Indo-Pacific planning must answer correctly, or face consequences that make Vietnam look containable. The question is not whether China will attempt to take Taiwan by force. The question on which the entire deterrence logic of American Taiwan policy rests, and on which the lives of American service members, Taiwanese citizens, and the stability of the entire Indo-Pacific order ultimately depend, is whether Taiwan's military can impose sufficient costs on a Chinese amphibious assault to make deterrence credible and to buy time for American intervention if deterrence fails. That question can only be answered accurately by an assessment process that is structurally capable of producing honest answers that may be politically inconvenient. And the assessment process that American Taiwan policy is operating with has the same structural incapacity for producing those honest answers that the assessment process of MACV had, the same institutional incentives, the same political pressures, and the same organizational dynamic of investment protection over operational honesty. The North Vietnamese Army moved south in January 1975, and the ARVN's actual capability was revealed in the most unambiguous way that military capability can be revealed, in combat against an adversary that did not care about American assessment products. The third major capability gap is the command culture problem, an issue whose parallel to the ARVN experience is perhaps the most direct and the most troubling of all the dimensions of the Vietnam-Taiwan comparison. Vietnam's ARVN suffered throughout its existence from a command culture in which senior officers were selected, promoted, and retained on the basis of their political relationship with the Saigon government rather than their military competence, creating a command hierarchy at the division and corps level that was populated not by the most capable military leaders, but by the most politically reliable ones. Officers who understood that their career advancement depended on their relationship with the political leadership above them, and whose operational decision-making was shaped by political calculation about the consequences of failure, rather than by military judgment about the requirements of the mission. Taiwan's military has undergone significant reform efforts in the past decade that have attempted to address exactly this problem, and those reform efforts have produced measurable improvements in some dimensions of command culture at the junior officer and NCO level. But American observers consistently note that at the senior commander level, at the level of the generals and admirals who would be making the command decisions in the first 72 hours of a Chinese assault, the Taiwan military's promotion culture still reflects a preference for officers who have successfully navigated the political dimensions of a military career in a democracy where civilian-military relations are complex and where senior officer appointments have historically been subject to political considerations that are not always aligned with strict military meritocracy. The gap between the command quality that the mission demands and the command quality that the promotion culture has produced is not an abstract institutional concern. It is an operational vulnerability whose consequences would become visible in the first 72 hours of a real engagement in exactly the way that ARVN's command quality vulnerabilities became visible in the first 72 hours of the North Vietnamese Army's 1975 offensive. The fourth and final capability gap is the reserve force readiness problem. Taiwan's wartime military strength rests heavily on its reserve force, which comprises approximately 2.3 million personnel who have completed mandatory military service and are subject to recall in a national emergency. On paper, this reserve force represents an enormous military manpower resource, whose mobilization would give Taiwan a defensive force of sufficient scale to impose significant costs on any Chinese amphibious assault. In practice, as American military observers have consistently documented in their classified assessments, and as Taiwan's own defense officials have increasingly acknowledged in public statements that would have been politically impossible to make 5 years ago, the reserve force readiness situation is far less robust than the nominal figure of 2.3 million personnel suggests. The vast majority of Taiwan's reservists have received their military training under the 4-month conscript service program that was in effect from 2013 until its reversal in 2023. A training program that American military trainers who worked with it consistently described as insufficient to build the individual military skills and small unit cohesion that combat requires. Reserve annual training call-ups before the 2024 reform program averaged 4 to 7 days, a period so brief that even the most capable reservist cannot maintain the perishable skills of weapons handling, tactical movement, communications, and small unit coordination that sustained combat demands. The logistical system that would be required to rapidly mobilize, equip, move, and sustain 2.3 million reservists in a national emergency has significant identified gaps in its vehicle transport capacity, its ammunition prepositioning, and its command and control architecture that would be required to integrate reserve formations with the regular military in the compressed timeline that a Chinese assault would impose. The economic and political dimension of why the Vietnam assessment mechanism is replicating in the Taiwan context deserves one additional layer of examination, because understanding the economic and political pressures that drive the assessment mechanism explains both why the mechanism is so persistent and why it is so difficult to correct through normal institutional channels. The American Defense Industrial Base, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, General Dynamics, L3Harris, and the dozens of Tier 2 and Tier 3 suppliers who produce the components of the major systems, has a combined economic interest in the Taiwan arms sales program that runs to hundreds of billions of dollars over the planning horizon of current and projected foreign military sales agreements. This interest is not corrupt. It is the legitimate economic interest of companies producing the weapons systems that American policy has determined are necessary to support Taiwan's self-defense capability. But it is an interest that creates a specific institutional environment in the interaction between the defense industry, the Department of Defense, and the congressional oversight committees that approve foreign military sales, an environment in which the economic case for continued arms sales to Taiwan is structurally aligned with the strategic case for assessing Taiwan's military capability as improving and adequate, because an assessment that concluded Taiwan's military capability was fundamentally insufficient to achieve its strategic purpose would raise uncomfortable questions about the value of the arms sales program that has produced that insufficient capability. This alignment between economic interest and assessment optimism is not a conspiracy. It is an institutional dynamic, the same institutional dynamic that aligned MACV's organizational interest in demonstrating Vietnamization's progress with the assessment products that MACV produced. The alignment does not require anyone to lie. It requires only that the institutional environment consistently and systematically favor the weight given to information that confirms the assessment of progress, and consistently and systematically discount the weight given to information that challenges it. That is exactly how the Vietnam assessment failure operated. And that is exactly the institutional dynamic that is operating in the current American assessment of Taiwan's military capability. America is doing something that the entire historical record of the Vietnam failure, the 58 out of 281 names on the wall in Washington, the decades of declassified documents and memoirs and oral histories that have made the specific mechanism of that failure the most exhaustively documented institutional catastrophe in American military history, should have made impossible to repeat in any form recognizable enough to be identified as a repetition. It is bailing water from the flooding lower decks of a Taiwan military assistance program whose field reporting consistently documents significant capability gaps, and pouring that water into the luxury cabin of an official assessment architecture whose institutional incentives systematically shape those documented gaps into a picture of steady progress and improving capability that the political and strategic requirements of the investment demand. The ship of American Taiwan policy is not sinking yet. Taiwan has not been attacked. The deterrent has not failed. The gap between the assessment and the reality has not been tested in combat in the unambiguous way that the ARVN's assessment gap was tested in 1975. But the gap exists. The institutional mechanism producing it exists. And the historical record of what happens when that gap is tested in combat, when an adversary who does not care about assessment products decides to find out what the military behind those assessments can actually do, is not a mystery. It is written on a wall in Washington in 58,281 names. America made this exact mistake once before. The question that the historical record is asking, with the specific urgency of a lesson that cost 58,000 lives the first time it was ignored, is whether the institutional memory of the American defense establishment is deep enough and the political will of the American national security community is strong enough to recognize the repetition before the test comes, or whether the test will have to come first, as it always does when the gap between assessment and reality is closed not by honest evaluation, but by operational reality, in the most costly and the most irreversible way that military history knows. Because history, in the specific way that it has of returning to the scenes of its unresolved failures, does not repeat the details. It repeats the mechanism. It repeats the specific institutional dynamic of investment protection over honest evaluation. It repeats the gap between the official assessment and the field reality. And it delivers the same verdict that it delivered in 1975, not in the conference rooms and the assessment reports and the congressional testimonies where the gap was created and maintained, But on the terrain where the soldiers fight and the deterrents stand or fall, in the most permanent and the most consequential test that any strategic assessment ever faces. America made this mistake in Vietnam. It is making it again in Taiwan. And the wall in Washington, with its 58,281 names, is the most eloquent warning in the history of the American Republic about what happens when the lesson is not learned before the test arrives. So we want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe the structural parallel between the MACV assessment mechanism that systematically overstated ARVN capability throughout the Vietnam conflict and the current American assessment architecture for Taiwan's military readiness represents the same institutional failure operating through the same organizational dynamics, and that the gap between America's official assessment of Taiwan's self-defense capability and its actual operational capability is wide enough, if tested in a Chinese assault scenario in the late 2020s, to produce a strategic collapse as rapid and as catastrophic as the ARVN's collapse in 1975. And given that the specific mechanism of the Vietnam failure, investment protection shaping assessment rather than assessment evaluating investment, is now documented in decades of declassified historical records that every American War College curriculum includes and that every senior American defense official has studied, does the repetition of that mechanism in the current Taiwan assessment architecture represent an institutional failure of such fundamental depth that no amount of additional arms sales, no additional training programs, and no revised contingency planning can address without first honestly confronting and restructuring the assessment process itself? We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. To make long journeys more enjoyable, we also welcome you to our Spotify, where we present our video content in audio format. TGN presented.